Today is August 4th,
That's right.
2018.
Uh-huh.
I'm here with Charlotte Buchanan, and we're at what's the name of the museum again?
The Mississippi Wildlife Heritage Museum, the only one in the state of Mississippi.
That's fantastic. I love it. It's a beautiful place.
It is, it is. I
Beautiful
enjoy
place.
it very much.
Wonderful. Okay, let's start from the beginning. Where were you born and when?
I was born in Kruger, Mississippi, and my parents were Tom and Frankie Pike Holloway. And I had 3 brothers and 3 sisters. And only 2 of us are living today out of 7 children.
Who are your brothers and who are your sisters?
Well, all my brothers have passed away, and 2 of my sisters have passed away. I have 1 sister left who lives in North Carolina.
What's her name?
Carolyn.
And Carolyn is your one surviving sibling?
One surviving sibling.
Okay.
And they're 18 months difference in us, so I wasn't the youngest and I wasn't the oldest. I was right in the middle.
You were a middle child.
Yeah.
Okay, and so what was life growing up? Did you guys live in Kruger for a while before?
We lived on a farm, and it was a wonderful life. My dad was a farmer, and we enjoyed being on the farm a lot. I loved the animals, horses, mules, cows, pigs, everything. I enjoyed the farm very much. And still, I would live on one today if my children would let me.
So what did your parents farm? Where did your father farm?
At Kruger, Mississippi, the farm was called Ashland Plantation, and my father farmed for a man from Lexington who owned the land. His name was Mr. D.C. Lundy. He was a very nice man. I remember him well. He gave me a Shirley Temple doll for Christmas one year, but I really wanted a BB gun. But I didn't get it. I got the doll.
Yeah, more traditional parents than back
Yes.
then. It's like, well, my daughter's not going to be having a gun.
No.
That's for boys. Yeah, it's funny. So what year were you born again? So you get a contract.
At Kruger?
And what year?
Oh, 1932, Christmas Day of 1932.
So you spent the rest of the 30s as your youth. This is during the Great Depression.
Yes, I don't, and I didn't realize that there had been one because we lived on the farm, and my mother had chickens, and we had milk, and we had butter, we had vegetables, and we shared with a lot of people. In fact, my mother, back then, they had people called them tramps, and they were people who had no work, had no place to go, and they walked up and down the roads looking for shelter or food. And my mother kept a table set on the back porch every day. They cooked the vegetables and whatever we had, and she set places on the back porch, and they began to know, and they would stop. Never seen them before and wouldn't see them since, but they would stop and have a meal. Word kind of spread.
That must have been very haunting in a kind of way, because people you would never see again.
Never see again, and never see again. But my father, I can remember on Sundays, he would load the car up with food, eggs, butter, things. We had a smokehouse, and he would have hams, and Christmas time and Thanksgiving, I can remember him taking to his cousins and other friends all across the Delta. He would deliver food to them. And that was, I guess I can say I didn't suffer during the Depression, but my father did help other people a lot.
That's very generous.
Yeah.
It's very Christian.
He was a good guy.
It sounds like it. Can you talk a little bit about your father a little bit?
Oh, he was, people told me that, and I thought so too, he was one of the best looking men they had ever seen. He had coal black hair and real blue eyes, and he was a big guy. Back in the men weren't very tall back then, but he was probably over 6 feet, and he was a handsome guy and had a lot of friends, and he hunted a lot, and they would my mother would cook whatever game he had, and his friends would come to our house and have a really good time. So it was a wonderful childhood.
Very fortunate. What was your mother like?
Oh, she was, to tell you the truth, very small. My father was a good many years older than she was, and he treated her like she was a queen every day. In fact, he would come in from the field, and we would be playing, and we had one big fan. It was a ceiling fan, which was, people didn't have those. We were lucky. And he would turn the fan on and tell us to be quiet and play on the porch, and she would take like a 2-hour nap. And we were children running around everywhere, but she had always had someone to help her in the house, and he was very good to her.
Very fortunate to have a fan ceiling fan.
Yes.
This is before air conditioning.
Yes, it was. Growing up in the Delta was wonderful for me. And a lot of people had very hard times back then, very hard times. And I guess my family was blessed. I don't remember us suffering any at all from wanting. We're not rich by any means, but we had everything we needed and more. So those were hard years for a lot of people, though.
So let's move into the 40s. You're about to be a preteen.
Well, I started to school when I was 5 years old, and I wasn't 6 until December. And I was the youngest one in my class every year, and I loved school. I couldn't wait for school. When it got this time of the year, I was ready to go back to school.
That's kind of a rare thing.
Yes, but I loved it, and I always loved the teachers that I had.
Let me just make sure everything's rolling, because I got to see from the side. Yeah, and keep talking. You're good. Just making sure, because I can't see it from here. I got to make sure everything's okay. What was the school that you went to, the grade school?
Kruger, Mississippi. And then my dad accepted a job at Dunleith Plantation, which is near Leland. And I went to school in Leland during my high school years. And he died when I was a senior in high school, and we moved to Indianola. And my mother had never worked outside the home a day in her life. But Dr. Joe and she had been to some college, though, which was rare for women back in that day. And she'd had some kind of nursing things that she had taken in college. And Dr. Joe and Dr. Arnold Hull hired her and finished teaching her about nursing. And she worked at the Indianola Hospital for a good many years. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was your family's first introduction to working in medical.
Uh-huh.
And so it said, about what time was this?
This was in 1950, 51, along in there. And I got married when I was not quite 19 years old. And I had my first child before I was 20. But and I think I've told you this, I have 3 sons and 1 daughter, and they are wonderful children. My oldest son and my daughter just took me to the Gulf Coast for a few days, and we had the best time.
It's funny because you had talked about I was down there too, by the way. I didn't tell you that. I've been gone the whole last week.
Oh, I knew you were going.
Before. It was the coast. It was more New Orleans and Panama City.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to New Orleans too. I love it there. It's one of my favorite places. My grandson, who just graduated from Mississippi State, I was telling him that one more time in my life there were things that I wanted to do, and one of them was to go back to New Orleans, and I was going to get his mother, my daughter, to take me. He said, "No, Nanny, don't do that. My mother's no fun. I'll take you."
Well, when you're in New Orleans, you need the right guide. That's a town that's built on fun.
Yeah, I've been to New Orleans numerous times during my lifetime, and I love it.
Let's talk about when you first met you were 19 when you met your husband to be.
Uh-huh.
What was that like?
I was 8. No, I wasn't. When I met him, I was underage. I was just 17. And he was an old school Southern gentleman, and he was older than I was, about 8 or 9 years. And he asked, I met him, and I was like going over to Moorhead to school, and I was already in my second year. And even though I was just 17, I'd graduated early. But anyway, he invited me and asked me to go out with him. We went to a movie in Greenville and went to a drive-in to get a Coke. And then on the way home, he asked me how old I was. And I very proudly told him I didn't know I was messing up, that I would be 18 on Christmas Day. Well, this was like in July or August. And when we got home, he walked me up to the door and kissed me on the cheek and told me to call him when I was 18. And I thought, my goodness, how can he do this to me? He knows he's the one, we know it. But he was true to his word, and I was to mine. I got up on Christmas morning on my birthday about 6 o'clock, and I called his house, and he was over there before lunch. So we got married in June.
What was his name?
William Buchanan. William Vassar Buchanan.
And what did William do? What was his job?
He was an accountant. He owned the old house right across from the Presbyterian Church was his office, and when he died, I sold it to Julia Rose. It's her dental office, Julia Hill now. That's where his office was.
Really?
Yes.
That's fantastic. I love her. They're her family's neighbors of mine.
Yeah.
We've known each other off and on.
Yeah.
As well as we could for years. No, she's fantastic. I love their family. No, I didn't know that was the building.
Well, it was a home. In fact, it had been a boarding house at one time, and it was first the Presbyterian manse, the preacher's home, and it was across. Wasn't where it is now. It was across on the other side of the church, and they moved it, I guess, when they expanded and made a parking lot, and they moved it across the street. And at one time, this Mrs. Jones owned the house, and she had boarders. Back then, different people had roomers and boarders, as they called them. So, but when he died, she contacted me and said she was looking for a place to have her office. And at first I didn't want to sell it, but then I knew I didn't have any need for it, so I did, and I liked her a lot, so I wanted her to have it. He loved Springer Spaniel dogs, English, and he had a beautiful dog when he died, and that dog, every time she had an opportunity, she would go back to that office. And Dr. Hill would call me and say, Miss Charlotte, you need to come get Mr. Bill's dog. He's back over to the office. And one day she told me, my patients don't know what to think with this puppy looking up at them all the time. But
so the dog had gotten used to.
Oh yeah, he took the dog to the office with him a lot, and she would get by his desk and just sit there with him all day long, and that's what she would do. And she'd wait until one of Julia's patients were going in, and she'd go in too. So.
What was the name of the firm, of the accounting firm?
Just William Buchanan.
Okay. I was just trying to get all the facts there. And in our last interview, you had mentioned working for my great-grandfather.
Yes.
Talk a bit about that.
Oh, he was a great guy, and he was a wonderful lawyer, and I really enjoyed working for him. I think I told you about when I went up to apply for the job, he told me that he didn't think I could do it because you had to know how to type. And I assured him I knew how to type, even though I was self-taught on a farm commissary typewriter. And he liked my work, and I went to work for him. And I worked. Then I got a job.
Hold on 1 second, just for reference for the tape. That's my grandfather Cooper.
Yes.
Who was a lawyer in downtown Indianola, upstairs near where Enterprise Toxin is now.
Well, then though he had the office across the street, it wasn't upstairs. It was
Didn't know that.
no. It's where you know where Q Davis's office. That's your granddaddy's office, and your great grandfather's office. That's where I worked, right there.
That's where it was. Oh, that's amazing. And like I've said last time, I found an old wire recording that has his law notes, his legal notes on there. You can hear people typing in the background.
Yeah.
It was around 1947, a few years before you went to work there.
Oh, yeah, it was.
You worked in 49 or 50?
No, it was probably 51, 50 or something like that.
Okay. Let me double check, make sure everything's still good. Fantastic. Awesome. Thank you so much for this. I like what we did last time, but we had 11 to death, Billy Johnson, and he was in the background making some noise. So this is so much better. Okay, so that was, you worked there for a while.
And then I got a Lewis Grocery Company offered me a job, Mr. Morris Lewis, and I kept his, Mrs. Sally Wiggles was his secretary, but I did all of his accounting work for him. And at the end of every day, I made it was a form that I filled out to tell him how much groceries they had sold that day and how much money had come in, and I put it on his desk every day. And I met the most wonderful man when I worked there that I just fell in love with, and fortunately he did me, Mr. Leroy Paris. I've considered him one of the best friends I ever had. He was a wonderful guy.
Tell me a little bit more about this guy.
It's Henry Paris's father. And Mr. Leroy was, not only did I love him, everybody at Lewis loved him. And there were people, Mr. Sam Swartz was a CPA out there then, and Dudley Burrell, and Alan Holloway. And I was crazy about all of them, especially Sam Swartz and Mr. Leroy Paris.
That's great. As you know, we did an interview with Henry at the Planters Bank a couple of months ago, and it was really enlightening. I knew very little about Henry.
Oh, well, Henry's a great guy, too. He certainly followed after his father's footsteps in being a very caring man, and that's the way Mr. Leroy was. There were a lot of people that worked at Lewis back then. That was one of the biggest employers in the Delta at that time, but Mr. Lewis and Mr. Leroy, they knew our children's names. They knew when we had birthdays, when we were sick. They were very caring. It was a wonderful place, but I hadn't worked there very long until I went back to work for Mr. Cooper. And then I went till I got the court reporting job, and I worked for Judge Arthur Clark was the judge.
Fantastic. So it's moved a little bit into the future. It's the 50s, getting a little older. There was a couple of things you may have written down that you want to talk about, but like, when did you get? What was next in terms of your employment?
Well,
you went more into creative oriented stuff.
Well, I had a baby when I was almost 40 years old, and it was time to quit traveling, and I stayed at home with my baby, and my other 3 children were, up in school. In fact, one of them was in college, the oldest. I said, you hadn't lived until you had one in college, one in high school, one in junior high, and one going to daycare. But it was a great life, though.
Oh, absolutely. So let's talk about WNLA.
Okay. I was not court reporting, and I was helping my husband in his office, and Eddie Fritz, who is the owner of the radio station, walked into my husband's office one day, and I thought he was there on some kind of accounting business, and he said, no, I came to see you. And I said, you did? Well, have a seat. And he sat down. I said, Eddie, why do you want to see me? He said, I want you to do a radio program every day at noon for me. I said, I don't know anything about radio, and I certainly don't know anything about being on the radio. And he said, oh, I think you can do fine. I want you to come out. We're going to do a little test thing. And I went out the next day, and he gave me some notes to read, and I did. I read it. Anyway, he said something on there, we'll now have a commercial break from so-and-so. And when I got through with it, I said, see, I told you I couldn't do this. He said, you just did your first radio program. And I did it for just about 25 years, every day at noon, Monday through Saturday. It was a wonderful time.
You had a hospital report. We talked a little bit about that last time.
We had the hospital report, but then federal regulations came in, and they could not give us the names of the patients anymore, which I thought was the right thing to do. So, I remember one time a lady called and was just furious because she had been in the hospital, and we said her name on the radio. Scotty McGregor. She was doing the hospital report, and she was furious because she hadn't told her children she'd been in the hospital, and she didn't want them to know she'd been in the hospital. So it was fortunate that we quit doing the hospital report.
Not a great way to find out.
No.
So, what years did you work at NLA?
Gosh, that's one thing that I can't remember.
No problem.
I know I worked there a long time, about 25 years, and I was always freelance. I never was not considered an employee. I was considered, as Eddie Fritz told me, talent. And I thought, well, I didn't, but anyway, it was a good time.
So who was your boss?
Eddie Fritz, and then he went to Washington as chairman of the NAB, National Association of Broadcasters, and Jerry Brophy, who still is living, was the manager of the station, and he later bought it from Eddie, and I worked there for him a few more years after that.
So I guess what I'm asking is, like, what approximate decades did you work there? Approximately.
Ben was born in 1972. In the 70s and 80s. Late 60s and early 70s, and part of the 80s.
Okay. Let's move on then. Did you have a couple of notes, I think, you may have written down?
Oh, I was going to tell you about my justice court judge. After my child was born, and I was working at WNLA at that time, and I was covering the board meetings and doing a report on all of that. And people were telling me I needed to run for the board as a board of aldermen. And then one day I had this gentleman who was one of the leading citizens of Indianola, and I had so much respect for him, and I still do. He's deceased. But he came to my office and told me that he thought it was time for us to have a woman on the board, that times were changing. And I was so flattered, and I went over and I qualified. And later that afternoon, my brother-in-law, Joe Buchanan, who was an attorney, came in. He said, I heard you were thinking about running for the board. I said, oh, I am. I'm already registered. And he said, oh, I hate you did that. I said, why, Joe? You always support me in everything I want to do. He said, but I want to tell you why. The Rotary Club wants you to run. There's another lady running, and most of those guys don't think that we need a woman on the board. They want you to split the vote with her, and neither one of you will get elected. And I was so hurt and upset. And I went to this gentleman and I asked him if that was true. And he said, honey, you'll be doing our town a favor. We don't need women yet on the board. And I said, sir, and back then you ran as at large. There were no wards. And the top 5 people got to be on the board. And there were about 23 people running. And I told him, I said, you just watch me. I'm going to come in first. He said, oh, you can't do that, honey. You're just going to be letting yourself in for disappointment. But on the night the votes were counted, I was number 1. And he was one of my biggest supporters, always. And he decided it was time for a lady. And I loved Mr. W.D. Dub Hemphill was the finance officer. And he was a very, very smart man, and always looked after the town's finances with a iron hand. I mean, when we left the board, we left the city in good financial shape. I don't know what it is now, but years later. But Mr. Hemphill, one night we were at the board meeting, and I brought up some subject, and right after I brought it up, Mr. Hemphill got up and left the room, and later on, David Russian called him and asked him why he got mad and left the board when I was talking. And Mr. Hemphill was flabbergasted. He loved baseball, and the World Series was going on, and he went out to his car to get the score. He wasn't mad at me at all. And then I ran, of course, I was Justice Court Judge for 4 terms.
Fantastic. Great. Yep. Okay, good. All right, start over with that.
And that was an experience because very few, I know I was the first woman to hold that position in Sunflower County. And that was a very job that really was like 24/7. The law enforcement would call me at 2:00 in the morning. Sometimes I had to get up and go, but I enjoyed it. But I had funny things to happen too. One day my husband was sick and I was late getting everything ready, and I called my clerk and I told her to take my robe and to take my docket, and I'd meet her at the courthouse. And I was rushing to go upstairs, and these 2 young men were coming across the parking lot, and they stopped me and said, "Ma'am, could you tell us where Justice Court is?" And I'm not supposed to talk to people coming to court, so I just pointed and told them it was upstairs. And they said, "Could you tell us who the judge is today?" And I just kept walking, and one of them said to the other, "Well, we don't really care. We just hope it's not that woman. She's meaner than a yard dog." And I thought, oh, mercy, maybe I've been doing my duty after all if they think I'm tough. And then another day, I had on my judge's robe, and I was running across the courthouse yard, trying to get to court. And I ran into this elderly gentleman named Jabbo. He had lived out on Dunleaf Farm and worked for my dad at one time. And I recognized him, and I stopped and I said, "Jabbo, is that really you?" And he was so glad to see me. He said, "Oh, little Charlotte, I'm just so glad to see you." And he looked at my robe and he said, "You know, you were always smart as you could be, but I never thought you'd make a nun." I said, "I'm far from it." So I said, "I've got a house full of children." And he said, "Why you got on that black dress then?" And I told him that I was a judge. And he said, "Lord help me, I hope I don't come to your court."
About what year did this begin with the aldermen and all this?
Let's see. It was in the 70s and late 70s and 80s that I got to be a judge. And in the 90s too. Yeah, I was still a judge when my husband passed away in 1993. And so I wish I could remember all those dates and times. But
I wasn't trying to get all nitpicky. I was just trying to establish a basic timeline.
Yeah.
Did you have a relationship with the Enterprise Toxin?
Oh yeah, I love Jim Abbott, still do. I've written, I don't know, hundreds of feature articles in years gone by for the Enterprise Toxin, and enjoyed every minute of it. He was a great, great editor. I always teased him because on Thursday morning when the paper came out, he wouldn't come to work. He'd send us all up there to work because people would be mad. It was a wonderful investigative reporter, and they really covered everything in Indianola, kept the town on his wanting to know what's coming out in the paper this week.
So David Rushing, just for
He
just
was
for
the
clarification.
yeah, and Joe Wilson, who lives in Inverness, would work there. David left and went to Plains, Georgia, from where President Carter's from, was the editor there. And Joe Wilson started working at the paper, and I loved working with Joe too. He was a great photographer. He worked over at the college after that. I think he's retired now.
Fantastic. What was it like when you addressed a little bit of this last time? What was it like during the civil rights movement?
That was a very time when it was a hurtful time. And there were things, I just didn't, I thought that all races should be able to vote. I've always thought that, way before my time. And I couldn't understand why there was so much, even threats of violence, and people wouldn't let, I know there was one store, and I won't mention which, wouldn't let the black customers charge anymore because they registered to vote, and they had been good customers. It was a very hurtful time for a lot of people. And there were people, though, in Indianola that worked very hard to keep things peaceful. Reverend David Matthews, who's passed away, and he just got honored by the Big Baptist Association in Jackson last week, and his widow, Miss Leland, was honored. And he and Jack Harper, who was the chancellor clerk for so many years, they formed a racial relation committee, and they did so much to keep harmony and peace in the community.
Did you ever see incidences of violence?
Heard threats of that, and I can remember there was a Catholic priest there, and Father Smichael, I believe was his name, and I can remember, this is one of my, I'm fond of him, he's one of my dearest friends, Carver Randall, but he was a young guy, and he was involved with all that, and he got arrested, and he had to come to court, and Father Smichael was with him, and I think about him, he was a good-looking young guy. I guess he was 18 at the time, 19, and standing there before Judge Clark, everything got dismissed. I can't remember what, and he had grown up and been born on the back in a little house on the back of Judge Clark's property lot, where Judge Clark grew up, and they were dear friends too. And another one of my, I consider a dear friend, is Mr. Cleve. Well, I knew Cleve McDowell from Drew, who was very involved with it. But there was and Fanny Miss Hamer would come in the courthouse quite often, and I met her many times.
Who?
Fannie Lou Hamer.
Wow.
I can remember they came in the back of a pickup truck, and other people, but there was a truckload of them, and they came to register, and they were singing "We Shall Overcome" and joined hands as they walked in the courthouse. And a lot of people were so upset, but I thought it was beautiful.
Wish I could have seen that. Was in Indianola?
In Indianola. Mm-hmm.
You have no idea how hard it's been to try to get stories like of this era. Especially when I transferred a lot of interviews from oral histories back to the library that Jennifer Rose and others did well before her time.
Yeah.
From audio to like digital for people, so you can make copies and they're safe and all that. And it's really hard to get this kind of information out. People just don't want to. Understandably. Yeah, they don't want to discuss that.
They want to talk about. Well, Sammy Eli.
One second. I'm going to just change it up a little bit. So, okay, tell me about Sammy Eli.
He was the circuit clerk, and Sammy came in and really, I think, saved the county from having more violence, because he readily would open the registration books. He didn't say, no, you can't register or anything like that, or make them repeat part of the Constitution. But Sammy, I remember Miss Hamer coming, and I was in the courthouse getting ready for something for court. And she walked in like she was going to have a lot of trouble. And he welcomed her and said, what may I do for you today, Mrs. Hamer? And she looked astonished. And later, she said that was the first time anybody had addressed her with the courtesy title, a white person. And she was, I think, touched by that. And it wasn't too long before they became Fannie Lou and Sam. They worked together well.
That's a beautiful success story.
Yeah.
of the evolution of us.
Yeah. Well, he was a great guy too.
That's wonderful. You addressed in your last interview about one of your favorite interviews you've done with someone. I think maybe somebody with SNCC. I'm not sure, but you had talked about one of your favorite interviews with someone. I think it may have been somebody you've already addressed.
Yeah, it was, and Mr. I'm trying to think of his name. I'm sorry, but it just, as well as I know him, it's just escaped me. But he was one of the first workers to come into Sunflower County, and he lived at Fannie Lou's house. And I remember he would laugh about some of the things that had happened to him years later. Of course, it wasn't fun when it happened to him, but he said the SNCC people gave he and these two other guys, they came from Tougaloo, I think, or maybe Jackson State, but they were furnished with a brand new white Buick convertible. And he said, now can you imagine 3 black young men driving up through the Delta in a white Buick convertible? He said, we were asking for trouble before we got here. He said, we asked them to give us a beat-up pickup truck. But he's such a good, Charles McLaurin. And I consider him a dear friend. In fact, one of, I guess you'd call him, I knew a guy in Indianola who's still, I think, very racial opinionated, but a year or two ago, I still go back to Indianola for certain things, and I ran into him, Mr. McLaurin, in the post office, and boy, we ran in to hug each other and all, and this guy looked at me, and when I walked out of the post office, he said, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. I said, for what? He said, hugging that, but he said the bad word, and I thought, and I just walked away from him. It hurt me.
As well, I understandable. And how long ago was that?
That incident happened not but about 2 years ago. It was after Mr. McLaurin had retired from the city. And Mr. McLaurin worked for the city, and Mr. James Robinson and I, the black alderman, and I he couldn't find a job, though he was very well educated, because of the civil rights work he had done. And Mr. Robinson found out that he really needed work. He'd had married and had a family. So we brought it up before the board, and he became the supervisor of the water department, and he retired from that just about 3 years ago.
Wow. So let's see. Have we pretty much covered your job histories? And I think a lot of that, haven't we? Yeah.
Uh-huh.
We can wrap it up soon. How many grandkids do you have?
Just 4. I have 3 grandsons and 1 granddaughter, and they all just wonderful. Will, the oldest, just graduated from Mississippi State. He's working in Starkville, thinking about grad school. He's got to make up his mind. And then I have Ben, my youngest son, has a son who's a senior in high school, and a son who's going into the 7th grade, and a little girl in the 4th grade. And His oldest son, all the boys in my family are not very tall. And all of a sudden, Brennan is 6'2" and a basketball player. Yeah, and he's a great guy.
So your husband Bill, he died in '93.
Uh-huh.
Um,
He had cancer for more than 12 years. It was a very difficult time. As some of those years, I helped him in his office, so he was able to keep doing his accounting work for a while, for many years. And then in the last year or so, we sold the accounting practice to John Maggio. And John had been wonderful when he was in the hospital in Memphis. He would help me and do things and never charged anything. He said, no, y'all got to have a living too. I said, but you can't take your time out to do our work, but he did.
That's wonderful. So that was the transition.
Yeah.
I guess, how about, do you have any thoughts about when 9/11 happened in 2001?
I remember that. I remember when it happened. It was on a Tuesday, and I didn't have court that day. Judge Burrell did, and I was watching the news, and I saw, when it first happened, I saw the pictures, and I called them at the office and told them to find a television, and they did. Somebody at the courthouse had one, and it was really, it was a terrible tragedy, And Donna Brazier, do you know her? Her son was at 9/11. He was in what did you call the building?
Tower 1, Tower 2.
He worked in there. And the whole community was just we were so worried about Daniel, so worried about him, but he made it out by the hardest. And he has been to Indianola to speak at the Rotary Club about that experience, what all took place. So, but he was the only one from Indianola that I knew of that was directly involved in it.
How about, I guess one of the last questions is, your sister is, what's her name again?
Carolyn.
Carolyn. She lives in what part of North Carolina?
She lives near Raleigh.
So central, north central.
Yeah.
How is she doing these days?
Not well. She has macular degeneration, and she's in a wheelchair most of the time. I'm older, but I can get around better than she can. So.
Well, hopefully she'll be okay.
Uh-huh.
I guess to wrap it all up, I love the last one. This one's really got more detail.
Oh,
so really, thank you for your patience.
Well, you're welcome.
Any last, any kind of insights after all your years of life and experience?
Well, I think having a good attitude about life is the main thing. I've been through my husband's illness and his death, and then I remarried, and a childhood friend, and I got married in March, and he died in November with a rare, fast-growing brain tumor. And we were very happy. When you're older, you seem to be more relaxed and didn't have too many money worries and no children worries. And we were enjoying life. We went to New Orleans a lot, to ball games. He was a football fan and enjoyed our life. And the year and a half before we got married, we visited my children and his children and went to different events and concerts. He loved music, so that was kind of a big blow in my life. But life has been good despite all that.
What was his name? And that was your second husband?
They called him Dieter, but his name was Tony Vincent. He was a fantastic high school football player. He was written up in the Commercial Appeal when long years, this was like 1949. They were playing Cleveland, their arch rivals, and Dieter made 7 touchdowns in one game. So,
That's and so let me double check, make sure we're good. We're pretty much wrap things. Oh, this is fantastic. We've done 45 minutes.
good.
And I know you're ready for it to be done, but I guess that's really it. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to say to the people of the future?
I'm just glad that I've had the life that I've had, and life has been good to me. I've done things I never thought I could do, like when I remember being in high school and I wanted to be a court reporter. I wanted to work in the court system, and that happened. And then I wanted to run for office, and I didn't know how my husband would feel about that because he was quite old-fashioned. But when I told him that I wanted to do that, he said, well, if you want to, I'll help you and we'll see what we can do. And he did. He did all my campaign publicity, everything, and walked door to door with me. That was another thing why I think I got elected. Nobody had ever campaigned in the black communities. It was just untold at that time to do that. And I went to every door in Indianola. Every door. He mapped us out a schedule and different streets for different days, and we did it. So,
that takes a lot of guts. You've been a big groundbreaker, you know that. You should be proud.
I enjoyed that a lot. So and there, a man named Nelson Dotson was president of the NAACP back there, and back in those days, and he had a wife named Mary, and she was legally blind, and I got to be real good friends with them, and he was one of my protectors. I mean, he would invite me to go speak at different functions, and if anybody had anything to say that wasn't complimentary, he was on his feet defending me.
Well, you made a lot of great friends.
No.
I bet it's been just amazing to see so many years of progress in race relations and in gender equality.
I know, and of course World War II was going on when I was a little girl. In fact, when World War II started, I don't know how old I was, but I was very young, and I would remember that I was skating at my aunt's house on her front walk when the news came over the radio about the bombing, and I remember my dad. We had a big old upright radio, looked like a piece of furniture, and every night he was glued to that radio and listening for the news.
Do you remember the first television you got?
Oh yes, my husband and I lived in Belzona, and they had the furniture store, and they had Zenith television, and I was so happy to get one. And I remember, I think it was I Love Lucy, or maybe, I don't know what the name of it was, but it was more snow than it was picture. It was a lot, and you could only get like one station, but it's really different now.
That was the 1950s, I'm thinking.
Yes, it was 1953 or 54, somewhere in there.
Mid-50s, that's right. Television history is kind of my thing for obvious reasons. There's a camera in front of you. And one last question, I guess, because I love these little tech questions of how things changed. You were born in 32. 32 or 32?
The 1932.
Okay. Did you guys have a car at that time?
Have a car? When?
Like when you were young, during the 30s?
Oh, no. We rode the school bus, and when we moved to Indianola, we walked to school. No, it was a long time before. Oh, I was married before I learned to drive. And I didn't want to learn, but my husband said, I can't run to the store every few minutes for you. You've got to drive. And he got this little Chevrolet sports car, and it was so cute. And so I learned to drive.
I know you're an Episcopalian. You changed over from what?
From Presbyterian.
And when did that happen?
Well, in the 90s. The Presbyterian Church in Indianola changed to Presbyterian Church in America, and they're arch conservative church. And we had a minister, and I was already a justice court judge. I might have told you this story, but and I won't say his name.
That's okay.
But he came to visit me at my office after he'd been in town for 2 or 3 weeks and put the town paper on my desk and said, "We can't have this. You need to resign this job." I said, "What do you mean?" And I had presided at a preliminary hearing for a rape murder charge. He said, "We don't believe in women holding positions of authority like this." I said, "I'm sorry. I got a child in school, and this is my work, and I love my work." And it wasn't too long after that I left.
That's when you had, yeah. I mean, you're not being ugly at all. You're just
No,
being totally
I
honest.
just
No,
couldn't. I couldn't deal with it.
It was time to move on.
Time to move on, and I think that church is still very conservative, which is fine. Oh, but when the Zellners came to Indianola, I almost wanted to change back. They were a wonderful couple, Reverend Eric Zellner, and she taught school, and I really liked those people.
I'm glad to, obviously I'm kind of biased because I was raised Episcopalian,
Yeah.
St. Stephen's and all that, so I'm thrilled to have you part of that.
Yeah.
And, Juliana Gray
I love her. She comes to see me, and when I was in the hospital and when I've been at homebound, she would come and bring communion and pray, do a little prayer. I just have loved her since the day I met her.
She's the best. Any last thoughts on God, or is that a little too personal?
No, that's not too personal. I brought up to pray every day. I was brought up to go to church, and I brought my children up like that. My youngest son is very religious. He goes to a Baptist church in Greenville where his wife went when she was young, and he's got a beautiful voice and sings almost every Sunday in their church. So I love the Lord.
I think this is great. Well, sweetheart, we're done. We've got
Okay.
almost an hour of footage.
Oh.
I'll turn these air conditioners all on so we can all breathe easy, especially your visitors.
Good. Well, thank you. I'm going to go up here and make sure nobody's waiting on me.
Please do. And I'm just going to get a little bit of footage outside and I'll walk around with the camera and I'll be done. I'll be out of your hair.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you.